The Vorthak fleet arrived on a Tuesday morning, their massive ships blotting out the sun across 3 continents. Admiral Crexmore commanded from his flagship, a vessel the size of a small city that carried enough firepower to level Earth's major population centers. He had conquered 17 worlds for the Empire, and this primitive planet would be the easiest victory yet. The first attacks came without warning. Orbital bombardment destroyed military bases in Colorado, Texas, and Nevada within minutes. The humans' crewed aircraft fell from the sky like burning leaves as Vorthak fighters swept through Earth's atmosphere. Major cities went dark as alien weapons targeted power grids and communication networks. Captain Ryan Hayes was drinking coffee in his office at Peterson Air Force Base when the first energy beam struck. The entire command center shook as ancient concrete crumbled and steel twisted into impossible shapes. Through the smoke and chaos, he could hear his communications officer screaming into her headset. "All stations are down, sir. We've lost contact with NORAD, the Pentagon, everything." Ryan grabbed his rifle and ran outside. Above them, alien ships moved like dark clouds across the sky, their weapons lighting the morning with deadly fire. His base was dying around him, but his men were still fighting. Sergeant Bill Murphy had managed to get one of their missile systems online and was firing everything they had at the nearest Vorthak cruiser. "It's not even scratching them." "Captain," Bill shouted over the noise. "Their shields are too strong." That was when Ryan saw something that would change his understanding of warfare forever. The alien ship was moving low, probably to get better targeting on their positions, but it was also moving over the old mining equipment depot on the edge of the base. "Murphy, can you rig those industrial lasers from the mining operation?" "The rock cutters?" "Sir, those aren't weapons. They are now. Get 3 men and wire them into the base power grid. When that ship comes around again, we're going to give it something to think about." 20 minutes later, the Vorthak cruiser swooped down for another attack run. Instead of military weapons, it flew directly into the beam from a modified industrial laser that could cut through solid granite. The alien ship's shields flickered and failed as equipment designed to mine copper ore burned through its hull like paper. The cruiser crashed into the mountains, sending up a pillar of smoke that could be seen for 50 miles. Ryan watched it fall and smiled grimly. If humans could bring down alien warships with mining equipment, maybe this war wasn't over yet. Across the country, similar scenes played out as human forces adapted to their new reality. Major Kate Williams was evacuating civilians from downtown Denver when Vorthak ground troops landed in the city center. She had expected laser weapons and energy shields like in the movies. Instead, she found aliens who moved like her own soldiers, who took cover when shot at, and who could be killed with ordinary bullets if you aimed for the right spots. "They bleed just like we do," she told her squad over the radio. "And they're not used to fighting in cities." "Use that." Kate turned the evacuation into a fighting retreat using abandoned buildings and construction sites as cover. Her soldiers guided civilians through subway tunnels while snipers picked off alien troops from office windows. The Vorthaks had superior technology, but they fought like they expected easy victory. Kate's people fought like they had nothing left to lose. In her secure facility 200 miles away, Zethara watched the news broadcasts with growing horror. She had expected a clean conquest, with human governments surrendering once they realized the hopelessness of their situation. Instead, she saw human soldiers using children's toys as improvised explosives, housewives building barricades from furniture, and elderly men teaching teenagers how to shoot alien weapons they had salvaged from the battlefield. Dr. Amanda Cross sat across from her in the secure interview room, taking notes as they talked. Amanda was a xenobiologist who had been studying Zethara for weeks, trying to understand Vorthak psychology and culture. "Your people expected us to surrender," Amanda said. "It wasn't a question. All civilized species surrender when facing superior force," Zethara replied. "It prevents unnecessary death and destruction. But we're not surrendering." Zethara stared at the television screen, where a news reporter was interviewing a group of children who had been teaching their parents how to identify different types of alien aircraft. The youngest couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but she spoke with the confidence of a military briefer. "No," Zethara whispered, "you are not surrendering." What she saw on those screens challenged everything she understood about warfare. The Vorthak Empire conquered through overwhelming force followed by negotiated surrender. They destroyed military targets, eliminated government leaders, and waited for the surviving population to accept new management. It had worked on every world they had ever invaded, but humans seemed incapable of accepting defeat. When their governments fell, local leaders emerged. When their military bases were destroyed, civilians picked up weapons. When their cities were bombed, they moved to the countryside and kept fighting. Colonel Steve Parker's defense of Colorado Springs became the template for human resistance across the globe. When Vorac ground forces surrounded his position, he didn't call for reinforcement or attempt to break out. Instead, he worked with city engineer Helen Davis to turn the urban environment itself into a weapon. "Every building is a fortress," he told his officers. "Every street is a killing zone. Every civilian is a potential ally." Helen showed them how to use the city's infrastructure against the invaders. Water mains became improvised explosive devices. Natural gas lines became flame weapons. The electrical grid became a way to coordinate attacks across the entire metropolitan area. What had been a city became a vast interconnected weapons system operated by everyone from professional soldiers to retired teachers. The Voracs found themselves fighting not just an army, but an entire civilization. When they captured a block, civilians evacuated and soldiers moved in. When they destroyed a defensive position, 2 more appeared in its place. When they killed human fighters, their children picked up their weapons and continued the battle. Admiral Crexmore watched his casualty reports with growing frustration. His forces controlled Earth's orbit and most of its major cities, but human resistance was actually increasing. Every day brought new reports of successful attacks on Vorac supply lines, communication centers, and transport vehicles. "These creatures fight without honor," he told his staff during a strategy meeting. "They use their young as soldiers and their elders as spies. They hide among their own civilians and turn their own cities into battlefields." His intelligence officers had been studying human military history, trying to understand their enemy's psychology. What they found disturbed them more than any weapon or technology. "Admiral, these humans have been fighting continuously for their entire recorded history," reported Captain Veltar. "They have never known true peace. War is not an emergency for them, it is their natural state. That's impossible. No species could survive constant warfare. Yet they have, Admiral. And they have learned to make war with everything. Their technology, their environment, their social structures, even their children's games. They do not separate military and civilian populations because they do not see such a separation as natural." Crexmore stared at the tactical displays showing human resistance activities across the globe. Red markers indicated attacks on Vorac forces, but the markers covered the entire planet like a disease. There was no safe area, no secure territory, no population that could be trusted not to fight. For the first time in his military career, Admiral Crexmore began to wonder if the Vorac Empire had chosen the wrong target. These humans were unlike any enemy he had ever faced. They fought with a determination that bordered on insanity, and a creativity that turned everything around them into weapons. But retreat was not an option. The Empire had committed to this conquest, and failure would mean disgrace for every Vorac involved. They would have to find a way to break human resistance, no matter what it cost. As the first year of war began, neither side realized that this conflict would reshape both species forever. The Voracs had expected to add another world to their empire. Instead, they had awakened something in humanity that even humans themselves didn't fully understand. 6 months into the war, Zethara thought she understood human cruelty. She had watched their news broadcasts, seen their soldiers use devastating tactics against Vorac forces, and heard their leaders speak of total victory with frightening determination. But nothing had prepared her for what happened when her own people came to rescue her. The attack on the secure facility came at dawn, as Vorac strike teams descended from the sky in assault pods. Zethara was in the medical wing receiving treatment for an infection when the alarms began screaming. Through her window, she could see alien soldiers in familiar armor moving through the compound's outer defenses. Dr. Amanda Cross burst into her room, followed by Private Ben Cooper and Sergeant Maria Santos. Amanda's face was pale with fear, but her voice remained steady. "We need to evacuate you immediately," Amanda told Zethara. "Your people are here and they're killing everyone they find." Zethara felt a moment of hope. Finally, her ordeal among these primitive creatures would end. She would return to the fleet and resume her duties as a warrior of the Empire. But as she looked at the faces of her human captors, she saw something that confused her. They were afraid, but not for themselves. They were afraid for her. "You don't understand," Zethara said. "They have come to rescue me. I will be safe with my own people." Ben Cooper was loading his rifle with practiced efficiency, but he paused to look at her with something that might have been pity. "Ma'am, we've been monitoring their communications. They're not here to rescue you. They're here to eliminate a security risk." The words hit Zethara like a physical blow. She knew Vorthak military doctrine as well as anyone. Compromised personnel were not rescued. They were eliminated to prevent intelligence leaks. Her months among the humans had made her a liability to the Empire. Explosions echoed through the building as Vorthak troops blasted their way through the inner defenses. Maria Santos helped Zethara to her feet, supporting her weight as they moved toward the emergency exit. Behind them, Amanda gathered critical research data while Ben covered their retreat. "Why are you doing this?" Zethara asked as they fled down the corridor. "I am your enemy." "No," Maria replied simply. "You're our responsibility." The evacuation became a running battle through the facility's underground tunnels. Human soldiers fought and died to protect not just their own people, but an alien who had been gathering intelligence for an invasion force. Zethara watched Private Danny Walsh throw himself on a Vorthak grenade to save the group, and saw Lieutenant Carol Brown stay behind to hold a choke point while civilians escaped. They were fighting her own people to protect her, and they were dying for it. The group finally reached the extraction point where helicopter pilot Captain Mike Foster waited with his aircraft running. As they loaded Zethara aboard, she could hear Vorthak troops breaking through the final defensive positions behind them. "Why?" she asked Amanda as the helicopter lifted off. "Why sacrifice your people for someone like me?" Amanda looked exhausted, but her answer came without hesitation. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because you're a person, not a weapon. Because if we stop protecting the innocent, we become no better than the monsters." That conversation haunted Zethara for weeks as she recovered in a new secure location. She began to understand that humans operated by rules that made no sense from a military perspective, but apparently made perfect sense to them. They protected the weak, honored their commitments, and treated even their enemies as individuals worthy of basic dignity. It was a lesson that proved crucial when she witnessed the Battle of Detroit. Colonel Steve Parker had been fighting a desperate defensive action in the ruins of the Motor City for 3 months. His forces were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of supplies. Any rational commander would have attempted to break out or negotiated surrender terms. Instead, Parker did something that horrified even his own allies. He called for a vote. Every soldier, every civilian, every refugee in the Detroit defensive zone was asked the same question. Should they abandon the city to save lives? Or should they make the city itself into a weapon that would destroy the enemy, even if it killed them all? Zethara watched the voting process through intercepted communications with growing disbelief. These were not military personnel following orders from their commanders. These were ordinary people, teachers, mechanics, store clerks, children barely old enough to understand the question, deciding whether to die fighting or live as prisoners. The vote was not even close. 93% chose to fight. Working with city engineer Helen Davis, Parker's forces spent 2 weeks turning Detroit into the largest improvised explosive device in human history. Every gas line, every electrical cable, every chemical storage facility was connected into a single massive destruction system that could be triggered from multiple locations throughout the city. When Vorthak ground forces finally pushed into the city center, they found empty streets and abandoned buildings. It seemed like the humans had finally learned the futility of resistance. Admiral Crexmore ordered his troops to occupy the city and begin converting it into a Vorthak administrative center. The explosion could be seen from orbit. 3 square miles of urban landscape vanished in a fireball that registered on seismic equipment around the world. 2 entire Vorthak divisions were vaporized instantly, along with most of their command structure and heavy equipment. The shockwave shattered windows in Canada and sent up a mushroom cloud that looked like a nuclear detonation. But what terrified Zethara wasn't the destruction itself, it was what happened afterward. Within hours, human survivors were moving back into the radioactive wasteland that had been their city. They set up refugee camps in the ruins, established medical stations in bombed-out buildings, and began organizing supply lines to support continued resistance. The people who had voted to destroy their own home were now voting to rebuild it in the shadow of their enemies' ships. They're insane, Admiral Crexmore said during a fleet command meeting that Zethara was monitoring. No rational species would sacrifice an entire city just to kill enemy soldiers. But Captain Veltar had been studying human psychology for months, and his analysis was more disturbing than simple insanity. Admiral, I believe they see it differently. To them, the city was not a loss, it was an investment. They traded buildings for military advantage, and they consider it a profitable exchange. How can the destruction of their own territory be profitable? Because they understand something we do not. They are not fighting to preserve their current civilization. They are fighting to preserve their right to rebuild it. They would rather rule over ashes than live as slaves in palaces. Zethara began to understand the true horror of what her people had unleashed. This was not a war between military forces fighting for territory or resources. This was a war between two completely different ideas about what life meant. The Vorthax fought to expand their empire, to gain new worlds and new subjects. They could be negotiated with because they wanted things that could be traded or shared. But humans were fighting for something much more fundamental: the right to exist as themselves, to make their own choices, to fail or succeed according to their own efforts. There was no negotiation possible because humans were not trying to win something. They were trying to avoid losing everything that made them human. As reports came in from battlefields around the world, Zethara saw the same pattern repeated everywhere. Human forces would retreat, then counterattack. They would lose cities, then retake them. They would suffer terrible casualties, then recruit new fighters from their civilian population. Every setback became a lesson. Every defeat became motivation for the next battle. Most disturbing of all, they were learning. The primitive weapons of the early war had given way to sophisticated hybrid technologies that combined human ingenuity with captured Vorthac equipment. Human pilots flew jury-rigged aircraft that should not have been able to function, while human engineers built weapons that Vorthac designers would have considered impossible. They are adapting faster than we can respond, Captain Veltar reported to the Admiral. Every engagement teaches them something new, and they share that knowledge instantly across their entire population. Fighting them is like fighting an enemy that grows stronger with every battle. Zethara knew that her people were in serious trouble. They had expected to fight a military organization with clear command structures and logical objectives. Instead, they were fighting something that was part army, part civilian population, and part force of nature. And for the first time in Vorthac history, they were losing. The ship screamed through Earth's atmosphere like a falling star, leaving a trail of burning metal and alien technology in its wake. Zethara gripped the control panel as warning lights flashed red across her vision, and alarms blared in the cramped cockpit. Her reconnaissance vessel, once the pride of the Vorthac Empire's scout fleet, now tumbled helplessly toward the blue and green world below. She had been conducting routine surveillance of this primitive planet when her ship's power core began to fail. The humans below had no idea that for the past 6 months, Vorthac scouts had been mapping their defenses, counting their weapons, and preparing detailed reports for the invasion fleet that would arrive soon. This was supposed to be an easy assignment, watching a species that had barely managed to leave their own planet. The forest rushed up to meet her as Zethara fought to control her descent. Ancient trees, taller than the spires of her homeworld, reached toward her like grasping fingers. She managed to fire the emergency thrusters once before the ship slammed into the earth with a thunderous crash that shook the ground for miles around. When she woke, pain shot through her left arm and green blood seeped from a gash across her forehead. The ship's hull had cracked open like an egg, and smoke poured from the destroyed engine compartment. Zethara tried to stand, but her leg buckled beneath her. She was trapped on an alien world, injured and alone with no way to contact her fleet. The sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. 2 humans emerged from between the trees, moving carefully toward the wreckage. Zethara reached for her sidearm but found only empty air where her weapon should have been. She was defenseless against these primitive creatures. Jake Morrison stopped when he saw her, his eyes wide with shock. He was a park ranger who had been investigating reports of a meteor impact when he discovered something far more extraordinary. Beside him, Lisa Grant clutched her field equipment tighter and stared at the wounded alien in amazement. "Holy shit," Jake whispered, then caught himself. Wow." Zethara understood their language from months of monitoring their communications, but she remained silent. Her training told her to gather intelligence and await rescue. She studied these humans carefully, noting their soft skin, their small size, and their obvious fear. They looked so weak compared to the mighty Vorac warriors she knew. Lisa stepped forward slowly, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. "You're hurt," she said gently. "We want to help you." The alien woman tried to back away but winced as pain shot through her injured leg. Her skin was a pale gray color and her eyes were larger than human eyes with strange golden pupils. She wore what looked like a military uniform made from materials neither human had ever seen. Jake radioed his supervisor while Lisa continued to approach the wounded alien. "Chief, you're not going to believe this, but I found a crashed spacecraft in Sector 7. There's a survivor and she's definitely not from around here." "Are you drunk, Morrison?" came the reply through his radio. "I wish I was," Jake muttered. Zethara watched as more humans arrived over the next few hours. Instead of soldiers or scientists, they sent medical personnel and rescue workers. Dr. Karen Wells, a trauma surgeon from the nearby town, arrived with her medical kit and immediately began examining Zethara's injuries despite the language barrier and the obvious fact that she was treating an alien being. "The leg is definitely broken," Dr. Wells told the others, "and she has a concussion. We need to get her to the hospital." Zethara tried to protest, but the humans were surprisingly gentle as they loaded her onto a stretcher. She expected torture, interrogation, or at least imprisonment. Instead, they gave her pain medication and covered her with warm blankets. The human doctor spoke to her in soothing tones even though they couldn't understand each other. At the small regional hospital, word spread quickly about the unusual patient. Military officials arrived within hours, but so did dozens of curious townspeople, reporters, and scientists. Captain Ron Phillips from the nearby Air Force Base took charge of the situation, but he seemed more concerned with protecting Zethara from the crowds than extracting information from her. "We're going to take good care of you," Dr. Wells told her alien patient as she set the broken leg. "I don't know where you come from, but nobody deserves to suffer." Days passed as Zethara recovered. The humans brought her food, though she could eat very little of it. They provided entertainment through their primitive visual devices, and even brought books with pictures when they realized she was intelligent enough to read. Slowly she began to speak their language, first single words, then simple sentences. "Why do you help me?" she asked Jake during one of his visits. Jake shrugged. "Because you needed help. That's what people do." The answer puzzled her. In Vorac society, assistance was given only to family members or military allies. These humans had no reason to care for her, yet they did so without question or expectation of reward. As her strength returned, Zethara began to understand more about human society through her conversations with the medical staff and her guards. They were kind but also curious, asking endless questions about her home, her people, and her ship. She answered carefully, revealing little about Vorac military capabilities while learning everything she could about these strange creatures. What disturbed her most was their apparent unity. Despite obvious differences in appearance, background, and beliefs, the humans worked together to care for her. She watched news broadcasts that showed conflicts and disagreements across their planet, yet when faced with something unknown, they seemed capable of putting aside their differences. 3 months into her recovery, Zethara received a coded transmission through her ship's damaged communications array. Admiral Crexmore's voice was cold and impatient through the static. "Report your status immediately, Scout Zethara. The fleet is prepared to begin the conquest of this pathetic world." Zethara stared at the communication device, thinking of Dr. Wells' gentle hands, Jake's simple kindness, and Lisa's curious questions about her homeworld. She thought about the human children who had drawn pictures for her and the elderly volunteers who read to her when she was bored. "The humans are primitive and disorganized," she reported finally. "They pose no threat to our forces." But as she spoke the words, Zethara wondered if she was making the greatest mistake of her life. These humans had shown her more kindness in 3 months than she had experienced in decades among her own people. And there was something in their eyes, something she was only beginning to understand, that made her doubt the wisdom of her people's plan. The invasion fleet was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. By the second year of the war, the impossible had happened. Humanity was winning. Captain Tony Martinez led his strike team through the wreckage of what had once been a Vorac communication relay station in the mountains of Colorado. The facility was supposed to be impregnable, protected by energy shields and automated defense systems that could destroy any human aircraft before it came within 10 miles of the target. Instead, Tony's people had walked up to it. The key was something the Vorthacs had never expected: humans who could think like them. Dr. Alex Robinson had spent months studying captured alien technology, not just learning how it worked, but learning how alien minds approached engineering problems. When she reverse-engineered a Vorthac cloaking device, she didn't just copy their design. She improved it. The frequencies are all wrong for human equipment, she had explained to Tony during the mission briefing. Their cloaking works perfectly against their own sensors, but it has gaps that our primitive radar can detect. We can use that. Now Tony stood in the ruins of the facility, watching his team members carefully remove intact alien computers, while demolition experts placed charges to destroy everything they couldn't carry. This had become the standard human approach: steal everything useful, destroy everything dangerous, and leave nothing for the enemy to rebuild. Command, this is Martinez. The relay is down and we have the intelligence package. Beginning extraction now. The voice that answered him belonged to Commander Susan Miller, who was coordinating the largest human offensive of the war from her floating command center in the Pacific Ocean. Susan's fleet was a strange mixture of salvaged military vessels, converted civilian ships, and completely new designs that combined human engineering with alien technology. Copy that, Martinez. Good work. Return to base and prepare for Phase 2. Phase 2 was the reason Zethara had stopped sleeping. The human command structure had evolved far beyond anything she understood from military theory. Instead of rigid hierarchies with clear chains of command, they had created a fluid network where information flowed instantly in all directions. A private on the front lines could share tactical intelligence directly with generals planning the next offensive, while civilian engineers worked alongside military planners to develop new weapons. The communication relay that Tony had just destroyed was part of a network that connected 17 Vorthac command centers across 3 continents. But the humans hadn't just attacked one facility. They had coordinated simultaneous strikes against all 17 targets, using intelligence gathered from months of careful surveillance and analysis. Within minutes, the entire Vorthac communication grid collapsed. Admiral Crexmore felt the disaster unfolding in real time, as his fleet lost contact with ground forces across the planet. One by one, his command centers went dark. Supply convoys stopped reporting their positions. Regional commanders found themselves isolated and unable to coordinate with neighboring units. "How is this possible?" he demanded of his staff. "Their primitive technology cannot penetrate our security protocols." Captain Veltar looked exhausted as he delivered his report. His intelligence division had been working around the clock to understand human capabilities, and their conclusions grew more disturbing each week. "Admiral, they are no longer using primitive technology. Analysis of captured equipment shows hybrid systems that combine our engineering principles with their own innovations. In some cases, their versions are superior to our original designs." The evidence was undeniable. Human forces were now flying aircraft that moved faster than standard Vorthac fighters, using weapons that could penetrate Vorthac shields, and employing communication systems that were nearly impossible to intercept or jam. They had taken the best aspects of Vorthac technology and improved upon them with human creativity. But the real surprise came when Susan Miller's fleet launched their counteroffensive. The humans had been hiding their true naval capabilities for over a year, building new ships in underground facilities, while allowing the Vorthacs to believe their oceanic forces had been destroyed in the first weeks of the war. When the hybrid human-alien vessels finally revealed themselves, they caught the Vorthac orbital fleet completely unprepared. "Multiple contacts rising from the Pacific," reported the sensor operator aboard Crexmore's flagship. "Sir, they're not matching any known human vessel configurations." Through the view screen, the Admiral watched sleek ships that moved like nothing in Vorthac or human fleets. They accelerated impossibly fast, changed direction without regard for normal physics, and fired weapons that seemed to bend the rules of energy and matter. "Those are our own gravitational drive systems," Captain Veltar whispered in amazement. "They have learned to build them. The battle lasted 6 hours and ended with the destruction of a third of the Vorthak orbital fleet. The remaining alien vessels retreated to higher orbits, effectively ceding control of Earth's atmosphere to human forces for the first time since the invasion began. In her secure facility, Zethara watched the battle reports with a mixture of pride and horror. Pride because she had helped make this victory possible. Horror because she knew what it meant for her own people. 3 months earlier, she had made the decision that would brand her a traitor forever. Faced with Admiral Crexmore's increasingly desperate plans to cleanse the entire human population, she had provided complete intelligence on Vorthak fleet positions, defensive capabilities, and tactical doctrines to human command. The information she gave them included the locations of every Vorthak ship in the system, the frequencies of their communication networks, the weak points in their shielding systems, and most importantly, the complete technical specifications for their most advanced weapons and defensive systems. "Why are you doing this?" Amanda Cross had asked her during one of their regular interviews. Zethara had thought about that question for days before answering. "Because I have lived among humans for 2 years, and I have seen what you are capable of when you choose to create instead of destroy. My people see only enemies to be conquered. You see potential allies even among your enemies." The intelligence she provided allowed human forces to target Vorthak vulnerabilities with surgical precision. More importantly, it gave human engineers the information they needed to fully understand alien technology and integrate it into their own systems. Dr. Alex Robinson's team had spent months reverse engineering captured Vorthak equipment, but Zethara's technical data accelerated their progress by years. Within weeks, human factories were producing hybrid weapons that combined the best aspects of both technologies. The results were devastating for Vorthak forces. "They are using our own weapons against us," Admiral Crexmore raged during his final strategy meeting. "They know our tactics better than our own officers. They predict our movements before we make them." Captain Veltar's latest intelligence report painted a picture of complete strategic collapse. Human forces were no longer just defending their territory. They were actively hunting Vorthak units across the globe, using superior intelligence and mobility to destroy enemy forces before they could react. "Admiral, we have lost operational control of 70% of the planet's surface. Our remaining ground forces are isolated in defensive positions that become more untenable each day. Our orbital fleet cannot provide effective support without risking destruction by human aerospace forces." "Then we implement the final protocol," Crexmore said quietly. "Complete planetary sterilization. If we cannot conquer this world, we will ensure that no one else can have it." Veltar felt his blood turn cold. The final protocol had only been used twice in Vorthak history, both times against worlds that posed existential threats to the Empire. It involved the use of weapons that would render an entire planet uninhabitable for centuries. "Admiral, that would mean the death of billions of sentient beings. Better that than allowing this infection to spread to other worlds. These humans are a plague that must be contained." But even as Crexmore gave the orders for planetary bombardment, he knew it was already too late. Human forces had captured enough Vorthak technology to reverse engineer their own spacecraft. Even if Earth was destroyed, humanity would survive among the stars, carrying their dangerous ideas to other worlds. The war was lost, but the Vorthak Empire refused to admit defeat. Instead, they would commit genocide on a scale that would shame them for generations, unless someone could stop them. In her secure facility, Zethara monitored the fleet communications and realized what her people were planning. She had one last choice to make: remain silent and allow the death of billions, or commit the ultimate betrayal of her own species. She reached for the communication device that would connect her to human command. There was still time to warn them, still time to prevent the final catastrophe, but doing so would make her something no Vorthak had ever been before, the destroyer of her own people's fleet. The Great Chamber of the Galactic Council had never hosted a witness like Zethara. Representatives from 47 different species filled the vast amphitheater, their diverse forms creating a rainbow of colors and shapes that would have amazed any human who could see it. But all of their attention was focused on the single Vorthak female who stood at the witness podium. 5 years had passed since the end of the human-Vorthak War, and the galaxy was still trying to understand what had happened. The Vorthak Empire, which had conquered worlds for over 1,000 years, had been utterly destroyed by a species that had never left its own solar system. It was a story that challenged everything the galactic community thought it knew about warfare, civilization, and survival. Council Speaker Yethmor, an ancient being whose species had witnessed the rise and fall of dozens of galactic powers, called the session to order with a voice that resonated through the chamber like distant thunder. We are here to receive testimony regarding the conflict between the Vorac Empire and the species known as humans. The witness is Zethara, former scout commander of the Vorac Imperial Navy and the only surviving senior officer from that conflict. Zethara had spent months preparing for this moment, but standing before the assembled representatives of galactic civilization still made her nervous. She wore simple human clothing rather than her old military uniform, a choice that had meaning for those who understood what it represented. Honorable representatives, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. I stand before you not as a Vorac warrior, but as someone who lived through humanity's first contact with the broader galaxy. What I am about to tell you will challenge your understanding of what intelligent species are capable of when their survival is threatened. The Zephirian representative, whose species was known for their analytical minds, interrupted with a question that had puzzled military theorists across the galaxy. Commander Zethara, our preliminary analysis suggests that the Vorac Empire possessed overwhelming technological and numerical advantages. How did a pre-spaceflight civilization defeat forces that had conquered 17 worlds? Zethara had expected this question, but answering it required explaining concepts that most galactic species had never encountered. The answer lies in understanding what humans mean when they talk about total war. Every species in this chamber wages war with their military forces, while their civilian populations continue normal life. Humans do not make this distinction. When threatened with extinction, their entire civilization becomes a weapon. She activated a holographic display that showed statistics from the war's early months. The numbers told a story that still seemed impossible to those who had not witnessed it firsthand. Within 6 months of the invasion, 93% of Earth's adult population was directly involved in the war effort. Children as young as 8 years old served as intelligence gatherers and communication relays. Elderly humans who could barely walk became weapons designers and tactical planners. Their entire species reorganized itself around a single goal: survival. The Altarian delegate, whose own species had surrendered to the Voracs after minimal resistance, asked the question that haunted every conquered world. But surely they understood the futility of resistance. Why did they not surrender when faced with superior force? Because they do not see survival and freedom as separate concepts, Zethara replied. To humans, life without the ability to make their own choices is not life worth living. They would rather die fighting than live as subjects of any empire. She changed the holographic display to show footage from the Battle of Detroit, carefully edited to remove the most disturbing elements. Even so, several representatives recoiled in shock as they watched an entire city transform itself into a weapon. This is what I mean by total war. These humans voted to destroy their own city rather than allow it to be occupied. They sacrificed everything they had built over generations for a single tactical advantage. And then they immediately began rebuilding in the ruins. The Crystalline Collective's representative, a being of living mineral who spoke through harmonic vibrations, posed a question that went to the heart of galactic military doctrine. Such tactics seem to violate basic principles of rational warfare. How did your forces respond to such irrational behavior? That is the crucial error in your question, Zethara said. We assumed their behavior was irrational because it did not match our understanding of cost-benefit analysis. But humans operate by different calculations entirely. She displayed another series of images showing human refugees working to rebuild destroyed cities while still under bombardment. They do not measure success by minimizing losses. They measure it by maintaining their ability to continue fighting. A human military commander will accept casualties that would cause any other species to surrender, because they understand that the alternative to fighting is the complete destruction of everything that makes them human. The session continued for hours as Zethara described the systematic collapse of Vorac military superiority. She explained how humans had reverse-engineered captured technology in weeks rather than years, how they had turned their entire industrial base into weapons production, and how they had fought with a creativity that turned everything from children's toys to city infrastructure into military assets. But the most disturbing part of her testimony came when she described humanity's psychological warfare campaign. The humans did not just fight us with weapons, she said, her voice growing quiet with remembered horror. They fought us with their history. She activated recordings of human broadcasts that had been transmitted to Vorac forces throughout the war. Instead of propaganda or threats, they were simple documentaries about human civilization, stories of wars, disasters, recoveries, and triumphs spanning thousands of years. They showed us their own destruction and rebuilding after natural disasters that killed millions. They showed us wars where they fought each other with the same determination they fought us. They showed us how they had survived ice ages, plagues, asteroid impacts, and every form of catastrophe their planet could produce. The message had been clear without ever being stated directly. Humans had survived everything their own world could do to them, and they would survive the Voracs as well. The psychological impact on our forces was devastating, Zethara continued. Our soldiers began to understand that they were not fighting a military organization that could be defeated by destroying its leadership or capturing its territory. They were fighting an entire species that had been shaped by millions of years of survival against impossible odds. As her testimony drew to a close, Zethara addressed the question that every representative wanted to ask but few dared voice. You want to know if humanity poses a threat to galactic peace? The answer is both yes and no. Humans have no desire to conquer other worlds or build an empire, but they will defend themselves with every resource at their disposal, and they define defense very broadly. She paused to let that sink in before delivering her final warning. The Vorac Empire made the mistake of seeing humans as primitive creatures who could be easily dominated. We learned too late that a species' technological level has nothing to do with their capacity for warfare. Humans fight not with superior weapons, but with superior determination. They treat war not as a political tool, but as a struggle for existence itself. The chamber fell silent as representatives contemplated the implications of her words. Several species were already known to be preparing diplomatic missions to Earth, hoping to establish peaceful relations with humanity before any misunderstandings could lead to conflict. In conclusion, Zethara said, I offer this advice to anyone considering contact with humanity. Approach them as equals, not as subjects. Respect their independence not as a courtesy but as a necessity. And remember that they judge other species not by their power, but by their actions. She gestured toward the viewing screen that showed Earth in the distance, a blue jewel orbiting around its yellow star. I have lived among humans for 7 years now. They are not the most advanced species in the galaxy, nor the most powerful, but they may be the most dangerous because they are willing to sacrifice everything for the right to remain free. The Vorac Empire learned this lesson at the cost of our existence. I pray that others will learn it more peacefully. The formal testimony ended, but the real work was just beginning. Over the following months, Zethara would meet with diplomatic missions from dozens of worlds, helping them understand how to approach humanity without triggering the defensive instincts that had destroyed her own people. She had become something unique in galactic history, a bridge between humanity and the rest of the galaxy, helping both sides avoid the mistakes that had led to so much death and destruction. It was not the future she had imagined as a young Vorac warrior, but it was perhaps the most important work she had ever done. As she left the great chamber, Zethara reflected on the strange path that had brought her here. She had come to Earth as a scout for an invasion force. She was leaving as humanity's unofficial ambassador to the stars.